a production of WGBH, Boston.
Hi, I'm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee workshop. You're not going to believe this, but today we're actually going to start building a boat. Not just a little model boat, a real sailboat that we can go sailing in. Now, we found the perfect sailboat in Seattle, Washington. I'll take you there next, right here on the new Yankee workshop.
The new Yankee workshop features the craftsmanship of Abram.
This is Lake Union in the middle of the beautiful city of Seattle, Washington, where there are more boats per capita than any city in the world. And this is the Center for Wooden Boats, a place where visitors can come and see wooden boats of historical significance, and they can even take them out for a sail. The mission is to preserve and pass on the heritage of small wooden boats. But today we're here to see a class boat called a Clancy. It's a highly refined 10-foot, 85-pound sailing dinghy, and it's built from only 29 basic parts. The designer of the boat is this man, Rich Colin. The name of the boat, Clancy, is Rich's dog. Bob Pickett wrote a book about building the Clancy. Bob, how difficult is it to build this boat?
The boat is easy to build. It's built out of plywood and epoxy.
And about how long would it take?
Oh, 2 to 3 weeks.
How does she sail?
Fast and safe.
Now, there's a whole bunch of kids here today. What are they doing?
The kids built these boats and they're having a race.
Well, I don't want to miss that.
Well, let's get in the committee boat and take a look.
Sounds great.
Start.
So what's happening now, Bob?
They are starting across the line. They will go down to this far buoy, sail around the buoy, and come back to the finish line here.
Yeah, this looks like fun. Well, you all did a great job, but the winner this year of the Clancy Fall Regatta is Trevor Jones. Congratulations. Good job. Well, Bob, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to the shop and build myself a Clancy.
Well, you better get going because we want to send you an invitation to next year's Clancy Worlds here in Seattle.
Well, I'll get to it.
Okay.
Thanks for all your help.
Thank you, Darrell.
Well, I can tell you this, building a Clancy is a lot of fun. You should allow yourself several days to put it together. And if you decide to build one, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before this program ends. Now, we're going to take 2 programs to build the Clancy. The first program, I want to get to this point, have the hull just about to this stage. And in the second program, we'll finish it off, rig it, and take it for a sail. Now, we found in our research that in small boat building, just about every one requires some kind of jig to get started. You build the boat, the hull, upside down. Now, here's our jig, made up of common 2x4s with plywood gussets, all assembled with screws and glue. There's some blocks at the front with the center line of the boat, and a wood strip right here which holds this centerpiece known as a crutch. And there are also braces that keep that nice and square to the frame. There's a center mold with a notch for the keelson, and the end is cut at an angle so that I can form the sides of the hull. There's a notch back here in the crutch for the aft bulkhead, and also an angled notch for the transom of the boat. Now, all the information is in the plan to build this jig. The material that I chose for the boat is a marine-grade mahogany plywood. The sheets are not 4x8, they're 4x10, and you're going to use every inch of a 10-foot sheet for the sides of the boat. Now, I want to get started today by cutting out the forward bulkhead. Now, before we cut anything, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now let's get to that bulkhead. Now I'm ready to install the front bulkhead in the jig. And I want to make sure that the vertical center line on the bulkhead aligns with the center line of the jig. Then I'll attach it with the screw. Now for the transom, which is a piece of 1/2-inch marine plywood attached to the jig in the same manner with a couple screws. Now from a piece of 2x6 Douglas fir, I've just made the curved cut on a piece which will become the knee, and that piece goes between the transom and the keelson. Now I'm going to attach the knee to the transom with a little bit of waterproof glue and some bronze screws. I use the bronze screws so that they can take the corrosive action of the water. Now this piece of Douglas fir is for the keelson. That's the part that you see inside the boat. The front end has to be tapered to fit the shape of the bow. The next piece to mill is this stem, which attaches to the keelson. It's a piece of 1.25 inch thick fir that needs to be tapered. To taper it, I'm using my tapering jig, and I've set the angle to the correct point and adjusted the fence. The front of the stem needs to be beveled, so I've tipped my saw blade to 30 degrees and adjusted the fence. It'll take 2 passes, one on each side. Now I attach the stem to the keelson with a little bit of glue and another one of those bronze screws. Well, now I've clamped the keelson on top of the knee, slipped it into the notch of the back bulkhead, here into the mold, and into the front bulkhead. Because the bottom of the boat has a slight curve to it, I'm going to have to bend down the keelson and attach it to the jig with a screw. Now I want to bevel the entire bottom edge of the transom so that it's at the same angle as the keelson. Next, I want to build this daggerboard case, and it has a slot in the middle of it that goes all the way through so that the daggerboard can be slipped in when we go sailing. Now, the inside surfaces will not be able to be reached again, so I've prepared them by putting on 3 coats of marine varnish. The first thing I want to do is attach these 1x2 mahogany cleats with some glue and screws. Now here's what the daggerboard case will look like when it's assembled. But I want the joints between the side pieces to be waterproof. So that's where our epoxy system comes in. Epoxies are 2-part glues. There's a resin and a hardener that must be mixed in the right proportion. And I only have about 9 to 12 minutes with each batch, so I have to move fairly quickly. Now, I mix the resin and the hardener first. And then for a bonding operation, I want to add some filler until the glue is about the consistency of mayonnaise. Okay, that seems to be pretty good. Now what I want to do is just butter up the edges with a coat of the epoxy and clamp the pieces together. All right, now I can put the other side on and put some clamps. Now you don't need too much clamping pressure with epoxy, it's just a firm grip, so these spring clamps will be plenty. Now we'll further secure the pieces together with a few bronze screws. Well, now let's clamp it in place. Now with a pencil taped to a dowel, I want to reach up inside and mark out the area of the keelson that has to be cut. Now with the daggerboard case removed, I can transfer my marks to the top side of the keelson. Now I've freed up the keelson and daggerboard assembly and mixed up some more epoxy, which I'm going to apply to all the bondable areas. Okay, now I got to carefully set everything back in place, clamp it, and attach the pieces with some screws. Now I want to trim the keelson so that it lines up with the bevel of the stem. Well, now we're ready to set some bottom panels, and I've applied a bead of the urethane sealant. I want to secure the bottom panels to the keelson with screws every 6 inches. Now I'm using some stainless steel ones because I ran out of ones made of bronze. Because the transom is 1/2-inch plywood, I'm able to secure the bottom with a few screws. The forward and aft bulkheads are made from 1/4-inch plywood, so I can't secure them with screws. I've squared a line from the keelson, and I'm just going to use a spot of hot glue to hold those in place. Well, I think the last thing that I'm going to do today is spend some time with my block plane, trimming the edges of the bottom so that it aligns with the center mold and both the forward and aft bulkheads. Well, as you can see, I already got started this morning, and I've put on one side, planed it even with the bottom, and rounded over the corners. Let me show you how I go about it. First, I mix up some epoxy, which I'm going to apply right along the stem. And I'm also going to put some on the edge of the transom. Now the pot life on this epoxy is 20 minutes maximum, so I've got to move quickly. Well, now I'm ready to put the skin on. I did a dry fit a little earlier, so I know about where I want to set it. And just one screw for the moment, right at the top corner. And a spring clamp down at the bottom. Now this process is called stitching, and it's a way to secure the sides to the bottom. I just use some hot glue about every 8 or 9 inches, hold it in place until it sets, and work my way from the bow all the way to the transom. All right, that's going to do it for the hot glue. Now we'll let the epoxy and a few screws hold the rest of it together. Okay, now the next task is to plane it even and round it over. Now I'm just using my block plane to put a 1/4 round radius on all the corners. Next, I want to attach the keel to the bottom of the boat with some epoxy. So I want to clean all the mating surfaces with acetone. I'm going to pour it right down the center seam, and then I'm going to spread it with my putty knife. Now the keel is a piece of Douglas fir. It's tapered at the front and it has a hole in it for the dagger board. I formed it the same way as I did with the keelson. Now this stick acts as a guide to make sure everything is aligned through the dagger board case. Well, now I'm mixing up another batch of epoxy, and I'm using a slightly different type of filler that's ideally suited to filling the screw holes. All right, more epoxy, but this time I won't use any fillers. Now the idea is to take this 4-inch fiberglass tape and drape it over every seam and tack it in place with some epoxy. Now you'll notice that the epoxy makes the tape clear. In fact, by the time I get done, you won't even know there's fiberglass tape there. All right, now I'm just going to pour a little line on the tape and using a plastic spatula, just saturate the tape. Now I got to move quickly before this epoxy sets up because there's another piece of tape that goes on top of this one to reinforce the joint. Point here is to work from the corner to the edges, removing any air bubbles. Well, the epoxy is set up overnight, and believe me, it's very hard. It'll even get harder over the next 4 days, so I want to get to taking down any excess. A paint scraper is great for trimming down the putty at the screw holes. On the fiberglass seams, I want to use the scraper to just knock down the edge, just getting rid of the little roughness on the edge. And then I want to turn to my sander and feather all the edges so that they just blend in with the wood. Now that's going to take some time. Now I hand sand the corners so that I don't sand through the fiberglass tape. Now on the prototype it took me about 4.5 hours to sand all the seams, and then I put a coat of epoxy sealer on the entire hull. And let me show you what that results in. The fiberglass tape practically disappears and is very smooth. At this stage the hull is ready for additional coats of epoxy, paint, or varnish. Now I've just formed a couple pieces of 3/4 inch mahogany for some bulkhead stiffeners. This one goes behind the aft bulkhead. The ends are cut at an angle, actually in both directions, to fit against the sides of the bow. There's a notch in the center for a piece we'll put in later, and a little bit of a cutout to allow for the bulkhead access cover. Now this one goes behind the bulkhead. It not only stiffens it, but it gives me a place to attach the deck structure later. Also at the bow I have these stiffeners, except there's two. Again, cut at an angle to fit the sides, and at the other end notch to fit around the dagger board case. I want to use a little bit of glue and some screws to attach them in place. Here I'm making a couple partial bulkheads. It's a piece of 1/4 inch plywood with a little block on the back side and a stiffener on the other side. And what I have to do is just glue them on and attach them with screws. I've positioned the partial bulkheads halfway between the fore and aft bulkheads, and I have a level that I'm using as a straight edge. And now I'm just going to take some hot glue and tack them in place. Now here I'm mixing another batch of epoxy with some filler in it so that I can bond together two thin pieces of plywood. Now this piece that I'm laminating is known as a carlin, and it connects the front, the mid, and aft bulkheads. Drop them in the slots at each bulkhead and bend it to the center. That's the reason I'm using two pieces of plywood rather than one, is because if it was 1/2 inch piece I wouldn't be able to bend it this much. Now a couple screws into the mid bulkhead and I can remove my bar clamp. Now what I'm doing is starting a process known as filleting, where the stern meets the bottom or any side meets the bottom. There's a fairly sharp angle. So by using an epoxy mix with a filler in it, I create sort of a cove, and that gives me a much better bonding surface. Now before the filler sets up, I'm going to lay in my fiberglass tape and wet it with some straight epoxy mixture. Once again, you can see that the tape just about disappears into the wood. Not only does this fiberglass and epoxy add a lot of strength to the boat, but it'll make the forward and aft compartments watertight, providing flotation. Now again, as we did with all the other seams, they're going to get doubled up with another layer of fiberglass. And I got to move quickly because I can't let that resin set up before the tape is in place. This piece of 1/2 inch plywood with the notch in it is the deck beam. And I'm going to start by just hot gluing it in place. This piece is filleted in and covered with fiberglass tape, just like I did in the watertight compartments. Now for the forward king plank. I've set some epoxy in all the mating surfaces, and I'll attach it with some screws. A scrap block of wood attached to the stem gives me a place to fasten the front end of the king plank. Now the aft king plank, which goes between the bulkhead and the transom, is fastened in place the same way. Now for the mast step. I'm putting down some adhesive first. And the mast step is made up of two pieces of 3/4 inch plywood with a 2 3/8 inch hole in the middle. And I'm going to attach it to the keelson with some 2 1/2 inch screws. Now the tube that the aluminum mast sits in is nothing more than a piece of plumber's PVC pipe. I'm just going to slip it down through the king plank into some adhesive in the block. Since the last time you saw this hull, I completed all the fairing, which is to say I sanded smooth and tapered all the fiberglass joints, both inside the hull and outside. Then I applied 3 coats of epoxy to everything, and this waterproofs the wood. And it's important to do it now because once the deck panels go on, it would be difficult to reach into the bulkhead compartments and apply the epoxy. I just completed removing any lumps off of the horizontal surfaces that the deck is going to sit on so that they'll fit nice and tight. The next thing I want to do is install this piece of wood, which is a solid piece of mahogany that I milled on my table saw. Now it's known as a guard or a gunnel, and it sits at the top edge of each side. I've also roughed up the epoxy right at the edge because I'm going to attach the gunnel with glue and screws. I've left these guard pieces long. I'll trim them later. I'm using 3/4 inch bronze screws to attach the guard every 4 inches. And instead of measuring, I just made a little guide stick. The advantage of these bronze screws is that they won't rust or corrode, and they're strong. I've extended a center line up over the top of the guard. Now using a dovetail saw, I'll trim it off. I've attached the other guardrail with some glue and screws, except for the last couple feet, because I have to fit this piece against the one I already cut. Now I've made a mark, and that should leave it a little bit long. Okay, now that's still long. I'm going to clamp it and make another cut. Okay, now that's pretty good, but it's open at the top a little bit. So now if I run the saw right down the joint, it should be perfect. That took care of it. The next piece to install is this solid piece of mahogany that I beveled on each side at the table saw, and that conforms to the angles of the sides of the boat. And this is known as the cutwater. I'll install it using some marine adhesive and screws. Now for the deck panels. 1/4 inch marine plywood, cut according to the plan and covered with 3 coats of epoxy. That's why they're so shiny. Now they're meant to be oversized, and the first thing I want to do is make a dry fit. And I'm going to have to make a little cutout for this mass tube. Now I've sanded the epoxy because it's almost impossible to get a pencil mark to show up. Now, if this cutout does not fit perfectly, we don't have to worry because it's going to be covered by a deck trim piece. Okay, now what I want to do is set it in place and make sure that it overhangs all sides by just a little bit, and then attach it with some screws. Now, these screws are just temporary, and later they'll be covered with deck trim. Now back here, the deck panel has to be trimmed along the center line of the boat. And the same thing up front. Now this line will define the outer edge of the guard. Now this line, which shows the exact edge of the guardrail, I want to stay about 1/8 of an inch to the outside when I make the cut for final trimming later. Now that completes the trimming of the panel for the other side. Now this is a polyurethane marine adhesive sealant, and that'll help to secure the deck panels and also seal off the bulkhead areas. Well, now I'm ready to permanently set the panel. And the first screws that I'll put in will be the ones that I used earlier, and that will assure that the panel is in exactly the right position. Well, now, once again, I'm using my guide stick to space the screws, except this time it's 6 inches on center. Now, the screws are more 3/4 by 6 bronze. Now, to trim off any excess plywood, I'm simply using my laminate trimmer. It's just like trimming high-pressure laminate countertops. Now, I didn't make a mistake. That hole is so I can stick the laminate trimmer down where the dagger board cutout needs to be. Now, with my jigsaw, I'm going to round off the point of the bow and then sand it smooth. Now, this piece of plywood is the deck trim, and the hole is for the mast tube. Now, the deck trim is attached with epoxy, which is a 2-part system. This is the resin, and to that I add the right amount of hardener and mix it up. And then I thicken it with a little bit of filler. Now we'll just set it in place and fasten it with some screws, and they'll hold it while the epoxy sets up. This is known as a plug cutter, and set up in my drill press, I'm able to cut some 3/8 inch diameter plugs from solid mahogany that I'll use to fill the counterbores on those deck screws. Now, before I go home tonight, I really want to get all these plugs installed. So I've just set a little bit of epoxy in each counterbore, and I'll just press the plug in place. Tomorrow, I'll be able to sand them off. Well, overnight the epoxy has done its job. It's set up and the plugs are firmly set in place. Now I'm using my block plane to remove as much material as I can. Then I'll sand them flush, round over all the edges of the deck, and apply another coat of epoxy. Well, I've waited this long to share a tip with you. When I built the prototype, I didn't apply any epoxy to the top of the deck panels. And I found as I tried to sand the plugs flush that because the veneer is so thin, I burned through. So now it appears that by applying 3 coats of epoxy first, that problem is eliminated. Well, after I completed the sanding on the deck, I vacuumed it off and took a tack rag and cleaned off any remaining dust. Now, I've moved the boat outside because I want to continue working in the workshop, and while this epoxy coating dries, I don't want any dust to get on it. As long as no leaves or bugs fall on it, we'll be all set. Now, all the epoxy coats that I put on the boat were done the same way. I used this foam roller, which gives me a nice thin coat. The epoxy is a little different than the one we used for bonding. It has a different hardener, which extends the life of the epoxy to about 35 minutes. Now, with the epoxy all rolled on, before it starts to get too tacky, I'm going to take a 4-inch throwaway foam brush. And I'm not going to try to move the material, I'm just going to smooth it out. Just lightly put some pressure on the brush and just keep going one section at a time, just with a slight overlap. While the epoxy dries, let's start working on the rudder tiller assembly. The rudder is made up of 3 pieces of plywood, like a sandwich. There are 2 outer pieces with a spacer, which allows for this aluminum plate to move. Over here I have 2 pieces of 1/4-inch plywood that I've epoxied both sides. I've sanded what will become the inner part so that I'll be able to glue the sandwich together with more epoxy later. I'm going to cut the pieces as one, and to hold them in place, I'm just going to tack them together with a little bit of hot glue. Here's the spacer that I also cut at the bandsaw. I'm just going to tack it on for the ride through the drum sander. That way all the edges will be uniform. Well, now it's time to assemble it. The pieces have been cleaned with acetone. Let's bond them together. Okay, now to hold them, we'll screw them together. Now that may look like a lot of screws, but I don't want to lose my steering in the middle of an important race. Now the screws that I'm using are a 1/2 inch by 6 stainless steel screw. And I'm going to install them from both sides of the rudder. And once again, some of these 3/8 inch plugs. The lower part of the rudder is made from a piece of 1/8 inch thick marine aluminum. Now let's make the tiller. It needs to have a notch in one end to fit over the rudder. And the very end of that notch is cut at an angle so that when you swing the tiller, it won't bind up. I found that the best way to cut that notch was to use my table saw with the blade set at the maximum height to give me the angle cut. And I've set the fence to start along this line. Then I'll keep moving the fence until I get over to the line on the other side. Now, if you look at the tiller, it's tapered fine along the top edge or the bottom edge, but along the side, it's still a little thick down where the handle is. So I want to taper that. One way to do that is to use the joiner. Now, how a joiner works is that the outfeed table is at the same height as the very highest point of the cutter knife spinning. To joint wood, you lower the infeed table. If this table is down 1/16 of an inch, as you bring the wood in, it'll remove 1/16 of an inch. Then the outfeed table will support the piece as it goes through. If I want to make a taper, if I place the wood on the outfeed table first, the cutter knife cannot even hit it. But as I push it down, it'll gradually taper the piece until about 1/16 of an inch is removed at this end. If I keep doing that, I get a perfect taper. With a round-over bit, I can dress up all the edges. as you can see on the top side, I switched to a bead bit, which gives me a little ledge right along the edge. Well, now that the epoxy has set up on the rudder, the plugs can be sanded flush. That hole is for the bolt that'll hold the metal part of the rudder, and this one is going to be for the bolt that holds the tiller. Okay, that takes care of the hole in the rudder plate. Okay, now that's a 1/4-inch hole through the tiller to attach it to the rudder. Of course, before I do the final assembly, I'll want to put some additional coats of epoxy on the wooden parts. Now let's build the dagger board. The dagger board is a board, or in this case, a piece of plywood that's narrow and very long. It slips down through the dagger board slot, and it has a handle at the top so it can't fall through. And what the dagger board does is keeps the boat from slipping sideways when it's under sail. Now, using my belt sander, I want to make a profile on the lower portion of the dagger board, sort of like an airplane wing, so it'll go through the water easily. Now, using my table saw, I've made a groove in the handle piece so that it'll slip over the plywood. Okay, now a little more epoxy to secure the handle, and I'll fasten it with some screws and plug the holes. Now, once this sets up, we'll seal the entire dagger board with at least 3 coats of epoxy. Now, after the epoxy dried on the deck, we brought the boat in from outside and set it up here in the paint room. This epoxy needs to be covered with either paint or varnish to protect it from UV. So I'm preparing the surface by sanding it with some 220 wet dry sandpaper. Now, this is an important step to remove any of the sanding residue. Otherwise, the paint just isn't going to stick. Well, what do you think of this for a color? Around here, we call it New Yankee Red. It's a marine enamel, and I'll put a couple coats on the bottom. And after they dry, I'll varnish the sides and the deck. We'll put the hardware on, and then we'll take it out for a sail. The sail, the mast and boom, and all the marine hardware we purchased as a kit from a marine supply house in the state of Washington. That source is listed in the measured drawing. There's not a lot of hardware. On the rear deck, there are 2 fair leads and a clam cleat. For the transom, there are gudgeons and pintles to attach the rudder. Inside the cockpit, there are 3 deck plates which will seal off the bulkheads. And on the forward deck, there's a fair lead and another clam cleat. The kit also includes some half-round brass that I run down each guardrail and the center of the keel. Well, I couldn't launch the New Yankee fleet without the help of my good friend Steve Thomas, a salty dog if there ever was one. Hey Steve, you want to check out my rigging?
Sure. Well, you got your dagger board in, and traveler here with a stop knot on it. That's good. You got your main sheet rigged, out haul, vang, down haul. Most importantly, life vest. I think you're ready, Norm. Shall we see if they float?
What do you mean, see if it floats? Of course it's going to float.
Swing the bow around to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Grab the painter, Norm. Don't want to lose it at this point.
Okay. All right.
Well, so far so good, Norm. Should we look in the bulkhead, see if we got any leaks?
Steve, it's going to float, believe me. All right, Steve, can we put the sail on?
You bet. I'll just drop the dagger board.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Why don't you hook on the main sheet to the Traveler?
Okay. Well, Steve, let me see if I can get the tiller on without getting wet. God, it's hard to do.
Well, I guess you can't put it off any longer, Norm.
All right, here we go.
Hop in there.
Hey,
Get nice and comfortable. Ready?
Great.
Bon voyage.
Okay. Oh, bon voyage. Now let me think. Tiller, sail, jibe. What does that mean?
These are great little boats, Norm.
It does go along nice, doesn't it?
Yeah. They float, they sail, let's race. I don't know, Norm, you're gaining on me. You're bringing the wind down with you.
Well, Steve, last one back to the dock buys the Ovaltine.
Ovaltine?
Yes.
Well, hi, Norm. What kept you?
Well, Steve, I did give you the fastest boat, you know.
Oh, yeah? Want to trade? We'll race again?
Sure. I hope you enjoyed building the sailboat. For a catalog of all the New Yankee Workshop projects, please write to the New Yankee Workshop, Post Office Box 9345, South Burlington, Vermont, 05407.
The New Yankee Workshop is made possible by
Porter Cable, professional power tools made in America and available through woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers.
Vermont American, the blades, the bits, the tools to make American workmanship better. Vermont American, the power in power tool accessories.
and by
Delta Woodworking Machinery, a full line of precision shop tools available at woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers. Delta, building on tradition.